I'm actually just going to go ahead and start with that brief introduction. This is really actually a fun story to share for our last session, because this is what MUN Impact is all about. I spent my sabbatical year traveling the world, looking at different MUN conferences where I knew there were amazing directors, and I was introduced to Peter. We actually ran into each other and started a conversation on a bus in Panama City. Despite him being from Toronto, he brought a delegation down to Panama, and we just connected, and he was just fascinated the work of MUN Impact. He invited me in February to come to his conference in Toronto, where I met an amazing group of students who taught me so much and inspired me to create some new programming in my own conference in St. Louis. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome Peter. I'm so thrilled that you agreed to speak today, to be a presenter, and to have several of your students be presenters and participants. So thank you for that. And with that, Zoe's going to tell us a little bit more about your history and what you're going to talk about today. Go ahead,
Yeah,
Zoe.
thank you for that brief introduction, Mr. Newman. So for a more in-depth introduction, Peter Oussoren is currently a high school geography teacher and MUN faculty advisor at King's Christian Collegiate in Oakville, Ontario, Canada. And he has a keen interest in developing global competence in students and ensuring that we hear the voices of a diverse group of people, especially those who live in poverty. Before King's, Mr. Oussoren taught grade 8 in Peterborough, Ontario, and middle school at the International School of Kenya. He's married to Julie, and they have 2 children, Nathan, 13, who was born in Kenya, and Cindy, 10, who was born in South Africa. Mr. Oussoren was born in the Netherlands. His own family has been described as small United Nations, each member from a different part of the world. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome everyone to our session, Defining Poverty and the Role of Students in its Alleviation. Mr. Oussoren, you have the floor.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm very excited to do this presentation. It is something that's I'm very passionate about. And it's been also so great to be connected with MUN Impact. And that has been a very fruitful connection for us at our school and our MUN group. And so we look forward to where this will take us. I'm just going to click share screen, and so that I can go through the PowerPoint that I have. And all right, make sure I'm at the beginning there. All right, so this is a workshop on defining poverty, and so I'm going to focus on SDG number 1. And what I'm going to talk about, and the premise is how we define poverty, I believe, will determine how we respond to it. And one of the goals for the SDGs is to completely get rid of poverty by 2030, which is an incredibly ambitious goal. But it is, if you look back at the MDGs that were implemented in the year 2000, to half the number of people living in extreme poverty, that one was one of the most successful Millennium Development Goals, and was accomplished very quickly, even within, I think within 10 years, especially in India and in China. So I think there's hope here, and I think that if there's a collaborated effort to tackle poverty, I do think it's possible. But how we define it does determine how we respond to it. And so this presentation is about what would be the best way to define poverty. And there's many different types of definitions. Let me make sure that I have to use the arrow. There we go. Okay, so some of the objectives are for you to give some thought to your definition of poverty. My hope is that you'll learn what schools can effectively do with SDG number 1, and to consider what I call a strategic rethink as you work towards the elimination of poverty, as you lean into SDG number 1 in your small way, perhaps in your community or even globally. And then to understand what I mean by from aid to enterprise, which is a common theme among poverty advocates at the moment globally. So those are the 4 objectives for this presentation. A little bit about who I am. A couple of things were already mentioned. My name is Peter Oussoren. I am a geography teacher at King's and the MUN faculty advisor at King's Christian Collegiate. We started our club in 2011, and it has turned into a very vibrant group, and which I'm very excited about. I lived in Kenya, and I have many connections there, including my sister, who has lived there since 1996. She worked for an NGO there and now has a business a business in water purification and water treatment and a consulting business. And personally, I've been very involved in community development. The three that I can just mention here is I headed up a 10-year partnership with a community in Eastern Province of Kenya called Ulungu, which is a community that this was from year 2000 to 2010. It was a 10-year initiative, and that community had so many orphans due to HIV and AIDS. And so there were a lot of grandparents taking care of grandchildren, and the community was wrestling with that. And so several groups on the Canadian end partnered with Ulungu as they tried to figure out what their strategic plan would be to try to assist the many, what they call double orphans, so kids who lost both parents. I've also, I was part of an initiative in Padere, northern Uganda, where after around 2007, 2008, when it became peaceful there were many people who returned to their land and they had shea trees. And so they needed to expand their markets for this very good shea butter product that they had. And so we were involved in importing that in Canada and increasing the markets. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. And currently I'm involved with an organization just outside Nairobi called Fadili Trust. They do a lot of work with in agriculture and in what are called village savings and loans. It's a type of microfinance. But my initiative with them is education and trying to send as many kids to school that they come in contact with that aren't in school but should be. So I do some fundraising on that. And then I just have a very keen interest in seeing families and communities thrive, particularly among the world's poor. I don't know if any of you have ever walked in a very poor area, whether it's rural or an urban, but I'm sure it would compel you to want to do something and to say, this isn't right. There's something wrong with this. How can we help people move beyond poverty and to see a wealth generation? Another thing that I do at our school is I teach a grade 12 geography course, and I take the students to Kenya for 1 month. And this is our group in 2018. We're at a place called Muli Children's Family, and that's a Kenyan organization started by Kenyans, run by Kenyans for Kenyan children who are either very vulnerable or for various different reasons. So this is an organization that takes care of 3,500 children, and it's an amazing place that grows tons of food. They export food. They have schools. They have they start businesses. They employ a lot of people from the community. So it's just a great example of rural development, particularly in a semi-arid area. So that's another thing that I'm a part of. Okay, so what I'd like to do, and I just have to make sure that I do have the chat here, which I don't at the moment. I'm going to see, where's the chat? I need to see, oh, here it is. Okay, good. I need to see the chat. So if you could take about 30 seconds and just write down, what would you say, how would you define poverty? If someone says, what is poverty? What would you say? So you can just write that in the chat, and then I'll make some comment on the definitions that come in. I'm seeing some very interesting definitions, very thorough definitions, and many of them deal with just lacking the basic necessities for life, that just eating and providing food for yourself and family, decent shelter, clothing is just very difficult. And that is essentially what the SDG number 1 is about. It defines it as making less than $2 or $1.90 a day. And what that really means, that's a helpful helpful for statistics, but in the end, what that really means is that meeting the basic needs is a struggle. And like I said at the beginning, how we define poverty is key in how we respond to it. So for example, we might say, well, poverty is a lack of stuff, which it's been my experience that when people define it that way, then their response is to give stuff. And that is one of the things that I want to unpack a little bit. Is that the appropriate way to go? And so here's often the definitions of poverty, and I see some of them in the chat as well. Is that you're materially lacking the basic needs. Another definition I've read about is a lack of choices. So you just do not have the ability to have choice, either choice to go to school or choice to go to a school that you would like to go to. It could even mean choice of where you live. I remember one of my students back in 2013, he came to Kenya with me, and he was doing his project on urbanization. And he looked at why do people move, especially in Nairobi, from rural areas to urban areas. And he was interviewing a person who was working as a gardener in Nairobi. And the student asked him, where do you like to live? Do you like to live in Nairobi, or would you rather live in your rural area? And the person he was interviewing looked at him almost not offended, but looked at him in a very puzzled way. And then he paused for a while and says, you talk to me like I have choice. I don't have a choice. I would love to live in my rural area, but Nairobi is where the money is. And so there isn't a choice here. Which was an interesting thing to unpack with my students, is that when you come from a certain privilege, you have choices. And so defining poverty as a lack of choices can be very helpful. Or an inability to take meaningful risk is another definition that I've heard, is that you're just not able to take a risk, either financially, so to take a risk on a loan for a business is just too risky, or even going to post-secondary education, to go to post-secondary school. That's a significant risk. That means you have to pay to go to school. You have to hope that there's a better option for employment at the end. And then you also aren't working while you're at school, and that could be a significant risk. And if you're poor, you might not be able to take that risk, or to risk starting a business is a very risky thing. It's a risky thing anywhere, but if you're poor, it can be very difficult. Of course, less than $2 a day, which is more helpful statistically, but doesn't necessarily tell the story. And the one I would like to challenge you to think about is that poverty it's an issue of a lack of access. And many poor people they lack the access to the things that help generate wealth. And so what do I mean by that is a lack of access to what? Access to water. Water is foundational to development. If you don't have water, how do you move forward? So this community that I mentioned in Ulungu, when they were working on how do we support the many orphan children due to HIV and AIDS, they got together for a week to plan strategically on how to develop their community. And in the end, their foundational their initial goal was water. He said, we can't move ahead without water. How do we do anything without water? And so the first project was a water project. Access to land. Land is a key issue in East Africa. It is an issue around the world. I know of an organization in Nicaragua, and one of the things that they do to help see people generate wealth is to secure land and title deed. And as soon as you secure a title deed, you can begin to lean against it and invest in a business. Access to education. I think one of the best ways to break a cycle of poverty, not just for a student, but for their family, is to help students go to school. Access to healthcare. If you are living under $2 a day, one of the biggest risks is one of your family members gets sick. And although there might be a clinic nearby, you can't take them because it's private, it costs money. And that it's a significant risk. So access to healthcare is foundational. Access to capital and financing. If you want to start a business, you need to be able to access capital. Reality around the world is for the wealthy in the world to borrow money from a bank is pretty easy. If I want to start a business tomorrow, I own a house in Canada, I could lean against that, borrow money, and start probably tomorrow. If you're poor, living in a slum perhaps, or on $2 a day, a bank is not going to lend you money. And so how do you access finance and capital? And so you may have heard of various different microfinance systems that try to do that. Access to markets and systems of productivity. The community I was working with in Pader in northern Uganda, they produce some of the best shea butter around. I mean, there's a West African shea butter and there's an East African shea butter, and East African shea butter is very, very good. But how do you get it to market? How do you get it to places where people will buy it? And so access to markets is key in wealth generation. Access to justice and equality. What I mean by that is, what is your recourse if things don't go well? If you're accused of something, you're innocent, but you're accused of something, or if somebody owes you money, how do you force someone to pay that back? And that your recourse is courts, but do you have access to courts? Do you have access to a lawyer? And so that is also foundational to a foundational accessibility. Access to the rule of law. I was watching a documentary not too long ago where they were saying that 2/3 of the world really do not have access to rule of law. There might be rule of law, there might be lots of laws and rules in a country, but it's just not accessible. Or access to security and safety. Again, my example is in northern Uganda. When there was conflict in northern Uganda, what begins to happen is the threat of what's called a green famine. Northern Uganda is one of the most fertile areas I've ever been to. And I remember when I was there, I thought if I was going to start a farm, that's where I would go. I mean, it's so incredibly fertile. And yet people were hungry. And the reason is that there was security threats. And if nobody's going to invest in seed and in fertilizer if any given day you'll be chased off your land. And so that is also foundational to building wealth. And then also access to dignity and hope, being treated with dignity, even though you might be poor. Poor people are not necessarily uneducated people. Poor people aren't people that are incapable, but they might just lack the access to be able to generate wealth for themselves and for their families, and then for their communities. And then you might have one yourself where you say, well, you missed one, access to, and we can certainly talk about that later. At the end, I will have a time for questions, which you can put in the chat, or you can just ask if we, hopefully we'll have time. So I'm just going to show you a quick little video about a gentleman who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2006. And he explains a little bit of what I'm talking about.
Go and look at the tallest tree in the forest and pick the best seed of that tallest tree and plant it in a flower pot. You get about a meter high or less than a meter high plant, exact replica of the tall tree that you saw in the forest. So what's wrong with this little one? Is it the seed? No, we picked the best seed possible, planted it on that. So what's wrong? The wrong thing is the flower pot, because you didn't allow the base on which it could grow. If you had planted in the real soil, it would be as tall as the tree that you saw in the forest. So poor people are bonsai people. Society doesn't provide them the base.
Okay, I love that. I love that idea that poor people are bonsai people, capable, full of potential, born with lots of potential, but their situation may not allow for them to grow to their full potential. And so that's the idea of defining poverty as a lack of access will then determine how we respond to it. And so one of the things that I would challenge you is to ask the question, not what causes poverty, but really what causes wealth. Why is it that some people in the world are wealthy? And maybe many of you are in a position where you'd say, yeah, well, I am in one of the, in the wealthier part, the percentage of the world. So what causes wealth? And if we answer that question, we might have a better response to how we address poverty. So what are some of the foundations, the key societal building blocks that will help see families and communities thrive? And that really goes back to this list here. Do people have access to water? Do people have access to land? Do people have access to education, healthcare, and so on? I think about my own country in Canada. The poorest communities are the least accessible communities, are Indigenous communities that live in reserves very far up north, many that you can only fly to or you can drive to on winter roads. And so their access to education is difficult. Their access to healthcare is difficult. Access to markets is difficult. One thing I tell my students is you could be one of the most entrepreneurial person ever born on this planet, the next Bill Gates, but if you're born in some very remote community where education, your access to education, or at least quality education, is limited, your access to markets and your access to security and rule of law is not there, it would be really difficult to live up to that entrepreneurial spirit unless you move. Now, maybe with the internet, that changes things. And so accessibility to the internet is key as well. So those are some of the building blocks that I think are really important to see communities generate wealth. And so you may have heard of this very famous proverb, says, give a man a fish, he eats for a day, teach a man to fish, he eats for a lifetime. The interesting assumption there is that somebody's poor because they haven't been taught. Well, you could be very educated and still be poor. The example that I like to use is in Somalia, up until about 2014, piracy was a major issue. And that started because of a failed government that couldn't patrol, as a coast guard, couldn't patrol its fisheries. And Somalia is very rich in its fisheries. And when the government didn't have much control of that country, there were other countries and fishing companies from other countries going in and fishing their water. That was the issue. So you could give a person there a fish, but they'd say, well, we have lots of fish in the water and we know how to fish. We know exactly how to fish. I come from a long line of fishermen, but the issue is access to the pond. Do you have access? Do poor people have access to the pond? So if I was to adjust this proverb slightly, I would add the issue of access to the pond itself. So how do you help people increase access? So when you and your school consider how to help the poor, I would challenge you to say, are we helping increase access? So if we define poverty simply as a lack of stuff, what tends to happen is people get busy filling shoe boxes of things and sending it around the world because a lack of stuff means you just need stuff. But it often comes with an assumption that that stuff isn't available in that country. And that may actually not be the case. And so as you consider initiatives to decrease poverty, consider how do you help increase access. And I'll talk a little bit about what our school does to do that in my own class. Here's a short video of someone who speaks to a similar theme of what I'm talking about.
Well, we often hear that half the world's population lives on less than $2 a day. And I think that statistic ought to raise the question in our minds of what happened to the other half. Half the world's population are living on more than $2 a day. How did they get to be there? The real question about poverty is the question of wealth, whereas so many of the solutions to poverty that we come up with are aid-based. And after half a century of giving very generous amounts of aid to places in the world that should by now, according to that aid, be flourishing, instead we find that poverty in many cases has been exacerbated. The rich in some of these countries have a vested interest to keep the poor poor. When you say business to a lot of people, they think of big business. They think of boardrooms and multinationals. It's true that some business is exploitative. We've seen that in the colonial era. We see that sometimes now with sweatshops, but it doesn't need to be so. There is such a thing as an honest day's work. If we're talking about the poor, business for them is the most natural thing. They're off to sell their goods in the local market, and they're working hard, and they're taking risks, and they're thinking about the future, and they're doing all the things that an entrepreneur has to do. It's the ability to provide for their loved ones, and that is going to include, in one way or another, wealth generating exercise. They're not going to get it any other way. These are harsh environments. We need to make a distinction in our minds between what's wrong about capitalism and what's right about capitalism. What lifts the poor is the creation of wealth and the empowerment and the dignity and the self-reliance that comes from that.
I'll show you another video about an entrepreneur in Kenya who's she's fascinating, and she speaks on a similar theme. And this idea, I mean, really in the end, what solves poverty for many people is a job that pays fair wages. And how are jobs created is by entrepreneurial people who start businesses. And these businesses are, what creates wealth is people create wealth. And so this lady, Eva Moruya, she speaks of something very similar.
There is no way that 50 years on, aid can be the solution for our continent. What we need is to create capability in the citizens of this continent to become creators of wealth, creators of enterprise. We should encourage them. We should accelerate the thing that they are doing. We should create partnerships so that they can access markets, they can access networks, they can practice entrepreneurship as successfully as it has happened in other markets. So I do not, in today's day and age, believe that our solutions are embedded in aid. I think that we need to create markets for what entrepreneurs are producing on this continent, that we need to address issues of quality, we need to address issues of packaging, we need to address issues of distribution, we need to address issues of brand building, and therein lies the solution that has often been tagged to be aid. We convert that to trade.
It's an interesting premise. Many people are beginning to say the same thing, that to move from aid to trade. I was reading a gentleman, an entrepreneur from Ghana. He said no country has gone from, say, a third world country to a first world country because they got so much aid. And it just doesn't work that way. Access to productivity, access to markets, fair access to markets is really the way in which a community and a nation develops. And so that helps us rethink, well, what does that mean? So we still want to be generous. We still want to see people move out of poverty, but what is a wise way to move forward? I think I'll pass on this video. If we have time at the end, I can do that. I can show you the video. And so what is our response to poverty is helping families and communities create wealth. Instead of what causes poverty, what creates wealth? What are the foundational things needed to see communities create wealth? Education is key. In my view, you can't go wrong in helping a child go to school, and helping a family send their kids to school. Not a family identified by me, but by an organization that is local and knows the community. I think that's number one. And hopefully a school where it's not just you go to school so you can find a job, but to be entrepreneurial and to create work. I think it's a global education issue that we shouldn't just raise job seekers, but job makers. And so access to markets, anything that can be done to help people access markets is key, and business support is also key. And so you can move, like Eva was saying, you move from aid to trade and entrepreneurship is what will be key in seeing people move out of poverty. So what builds wealth? Well, access to quality education. That's SDG number 4. The Millennium Development Goal was access to education, and now it's moved up to quality education. Access to fair loans and finance. And fair is key. I've been in northern Uganda where people were offering loans for 3% a month. That's 36% a year. Can you imagine? I can loan money here in Canada at 3% a year. And those start getting into usury rates. I've seen loans as high as 76%, probably even higher. Access to land and title deed is really key, as I mentioned before. Access to rights and justice, and support by good government that allows and sees it, entrepreneurship, and see its people thrive and provide the room to be entrepreneurial. And that doesn't happen in all nations. Sometimes entrepreneurship is seen as a threat by its government. And so good government is foundational. So what could be the role of your school? I think it's very important that if you're considering this, to connect with a local organization. That could be local in your own community. Maybe it's knowing about food security issues in your own community. Our school is involved with several food banks. One of the things that we're realizing very quickly is during this COVID time, the dependency on food banks is increasing. And so we are involved with some of that, and we want to know, well, what kinds of food is needed, what's not needed, and so on. Or maybe it's a local organization in another country, like for us in Kenya. And then perhaps you can visit, learn, and listen to the needs of that area. I think that's really key, is the idea that when you visit, you take the mindset, the posture of learning and listening, and just knowing what exactly the challenges are. The organization that we are very connected to, as I mentioned, was Fideli Trust. I'll talk a little bit more about them in a minute. And the idea of, can we support entrepreneurship? Can we support businesses that will then help families? In the end, a business will grow, and it will eventually then hire people, and that means jobs, and that will see more people out of business. Sometimes aid can be a big threat to businesses in developing nations. Whereas if you're a textile, if you make and sell clothing, and a whole bunch of donated clothing is dumped in your area, I mean, you can't compete with free. That could be your biggest risk as a business. And I've seen that many times, especially in northern Uganda, where people are very entrepreneurial, but their big risk is free stuff coming into their areas. And so how do you support the work of local organizations and those living in poverty to gain access, boost dignity, and provide provide hope for the future? A couple of examples here. This is a photo taken a while ago, Fideli Trust. The lady that you see here, that is Josephine. She started Fideli Trust. The word Fideli is compassion or mercy in Kiswahili. And she started this in the year 2001 as a response to HIV and AIDS and counseling. It has since morphed into an organization that helps farmers increase their yield on their land, and also provide village savings and loans so that people can start businesses. And that comes with an encouragement for saving, an encouragement for lending to one another. Essentially, they're like little credit unions. It's unbelievable, the success of the village savings and loans. And as they do that work, they come across students who aren't in school but should be. And so that's where we come in, myself and my classes at King's. We raise support for students so that they can go to school. The gentleman that you see on the left, he is a gentleman, he came to Kenya as a refugee from Rwanda shortly after 1994, and his kids are being supported by Fideli. And the gentleman standing next to me is the financial officer of the organization, and his name is Sam. So I work very closely with them. And so a couple of stories here. The girl at the gate on the left, her name is Joyce. She has quite the story. She's Maasai. She was going to be arranged to be married at age 11, and which I won't get into all the details, but she and her half-sister ran away from that. And she was supported by her brother for a while, and now she's supported by Fideli Trust. And we supported her through elementary school and high school, and now she's going to university to become a nurse. And her hope is to provide healthcare to her home community, and to increase access to healthcare for that community. And so we're really hoping that she will be able to attain her hopes and to be able to do exactly what she dreams to do. But it needs support. It needs support to go to school. the picture at the bottom is, you see the gentleman with the graduation hat. He has a very interesting story as well. He is one of 7 in the family. His father lost his job, and so they ended up in poverty very quickly. And he was in second year university at the time in engineering. And he approached Fidelity Trust and he said, could you support me and my siblings for the next 2 years at least, so I can finish. And then when I get a job, I will support all my siblings. And that is exactly what happened. He finished, he got a part-time job, but he said, that's enough for me to help my siblings go to school. So they were on our roster to support for 2 years. And then he now is an incredibly generous person supporting his family, including his own parents. And so these are some of the impacts of helping students go to school. It's not just an education. Many of these schools are boarding schools. It means a meal. It means you're fruitfully busy with something. One of the concerns we have is that you have, when especially young boys aren't in school, they're idle, and that can mean, in some cases, trouble. So schooling has so many positive impacts. And this gentleman, he's an incredibly generous person and continues to support his family. Another thing so that's one of the things that we do at King's, is to try to send students to school. And another thing that my World Issues class does is we host a global market, and we try to get as many vendors as possible into the school on one day, usually around Christmas time, and they sell things that come from all over the world. So this lady here buys things from vendors and artisans in Kenya, and she sells them, increasing their market in Canada. This is Moya shea butter, which comes from northern Uganda, and so it is a marketed product, branded and everything. The word Moya, it just means shea butter. And the lady, Debbie Van Grieken, runs this business and buys directly from the farmers in Uganda. Again, the people need markets. Shea trees they're a fascinating tree, but they take 25 years before they start bearing fruit, and they're not fully mature till they're 40 years. But sometimes they get cut down to be made into charcoal, and they're trying to convince people to not cut these very valuable trees down. Here's a lady from Egypt who works in very poor communities, making jewelry, and so she sells that in Canada, and she has close connections with the artisans. These 2 ladies are from Kenya, and they sell all kinds of things from Kenya, increasing markets. This is a gentleman who has a lot of connections in Nicaragua, in Ecuador, and in Nepal, and works directly with people who make clothing in those 3 countries. This is also a lady from Egypt who sells all kinds of things from local artisans as well. This is a lady from Ghana who has family in Ghana and makes various different products, a lot of shea type products. And so yeah, we have several industries that come in that are ethically sourced. They try to pay fair trade and fair prices, limit the amount of middlemen, middle people who might take a cut, just to try to make it direct trade. And so that is that the idea there is that there is access to markets. Okay, I don't know how much, I've lost track of time a little bit. Zoe, where are we at?
Yeah, we have about 8 minutes left. So if you want to move into the Q&A.
Yes, okay, perfect. Well, that's where I'm at. So if you have any questions, I'll just stop sharing my screen, if that's best.
Okay. Yeah, so everyone can turn their cameras on for the Q&A, and you can raise your hand, and then once you're called on, you can turn your mic on and ask the presenter the questions directly. Or you can also ask in the chat if you're more comfortable with that. Okay, so it looks like we already have a bunch of questions. So we're going to start with Amaya. Amaya, would you like to ask your question? Oh, I think it's in the chat. She wrote it.
Okay, I'm just looking for, at the bottom.
Mm-hmm. So I could say it out loud. So Amaya asks, don't you believe that since all the SDGs are interconnected, by achieving the goal of eradicating poverty, we could take more successful steps in the path of achieving other SDGs?
Yeah, that's a very good observation. None of the SDGs stand alone. And I think it's interesting that the first one is no poverty, but all the other ones relate. So education relates, life on land relates, so many good institutions. I think it's number 16, equality. Those are all connected to generating, seeing people generate wealth and seeing the reduction in poverty. So none of them stand alone. And so, Amaya, I think that's a very astute observation. If we work on all the SDGs, we will achieve SDG number 1.
Okay, so we're going to continue, but my co-admin Mariam is going to take the Q&A over from here because I have to go to the social hour. So
okay, all right. Well, thank you, Zoe.
Right, so there's a question from Charlotte. She's written it in the chat. Charlotte, do you want to unmute yourself and tell us maybe? Or read out the question?
Yeah, I was just wondering, because in zoos you see a lot of the cuddly toys and stuff, and I thought, would it really help the countries that are African, say perhaps, to sell their handmade, crafted giraffes and stuff instead? Do you think that would be useful?
So what's happening is that there's a shop at the zoo that sells these things?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the way, I mean, I don't know exactly the details, but of this particular zoo, but you know, anytime that somebody who makes something in, say, a country like Kenya can increase the markets and make sales, and as long as those sales are fair prices, that's a really good thing. And you know, you can imagine yourself, if you made something that you just can't get enough buyers, when somebody comes along and buys a lot of your stuff and puts it in a store in say at a zoo in the UK, that's a good thing. That's trade, and that will help those people, you know, send their kids to school, and if someone gets sick, they can afford the hospital and so on. Having said that, I do think that there are times where there's exploitation. So, you know, like the one gentleman says, you know, a good, what did he say? There is such thing as a good hard day's work. I mean, good meaning, you know, you treat people well and not try to get away with as little as possible. And if you've ever studied the chocolate trade, I mean, that's one of the issues in the chocolate industry.
Thank you, Charlotte. Lisa has her hand raised. Lisa, would you like to go ahead and say your question?
Hi, thank you. The point you made about the chocolate trade was great, and that's a more structural problem that needs to be solved. But if we kind of shift the focus from poverty in the continent of Africa and further on to poverty in the developed countries, right? Mm-hmm. So, say for example, we know that 25% of Indigenous peoples in your country, Canada, live under the poverty line, and 40% of Indigenous children live below the poverty line. How can we address issues of poverty in developed countries where the government is equipped with the tools and the finances that are needed to eradicate these problems?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the concerns in Canada is that Indigenous issues become political very quickly. And I know that many Indigenous communities desire access to markets. And there are some very active communities that do exactly that. And the leadership in the communities will push for entrepreneurship and access to markets. But in many communities, water remains an issue, and a lot of the things that I mentioned remain issues, and they do tend to get political very quickly. And so, you know, I don't like necessarily the first world, third world distinction, because even in many what we call first world countries, there are third world conditions. There are conditions in our native communities that are shameful, and it, you know, but then the question is, what's the answer? You know, I think it is an issue of accessibility, making sure that people have access to healthcare and making sure people have access to water and all the foundational things that people need to generate wealth. I don't know if I've really answered your question, but you raise a very good point.
I think we have time for one more short question.
Right. There's a question, but from Anita in the chat. Anita, if I'm just going to unmute you, if you could say it out loud.
Thank you. Your presentation was really good. I just wanted to ask about things like, we know for a fact that only one of the billionaires in our world could solve and eradicate all poverty, but it's not in their interest. Doesn't that type of like mentality show for other moderate wealthy people that they shouldn't have to volunteer because it's also not in their interest? If it's not in the interest of the richest person in the world, why should it be in their interest? And how do we destigmatize this and make sure that more people actually help?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there are some incredibly wealthy people who could do a lot to deal with poverty, but how do you eradicate it? Is it a whole bunch of handouts, or what is the way to eradicate that? Is it changing systems that keep people from accessing markets? Like what exactly? How would that unfold?
Right. I think we have just enough time for another short question. There is a question by Emmanuel in the chat. I'm gonna try and unmute him and let's see if he wants to say it out loud. Let's see. Here we go. Emmanuel, can you? Okay. There we go.
Can you unmute yourself, man? There you go.
Yeah. In countries such as Myanmar, the local products are normally not supported due to people believe national products are bad and they prefer their foreign ones. So why do you recommend me to make them support national entrepreneurship, no matter if products are not as good as the foreign ones?
I'm sorry, you were clipping out for a little bit. I'm not quite sure. I wasn't quite clear on your question.
Emmanuel, I'm going to go ahead and read it for you. In countries such as mine, one, the local products are normally not supported due to people who believe national products are bad and they prefer the foreign ones. What do you recommend to make them support national entrepreneurship, no matter if products are not as good as foreign ones?
Yeah, I see it now in the chat. It's a great question. It's an issue in Kenya too, where it's almost this idea that if it's made somewhere else, it's better. And the lady from Kenya says something very interesting. Says part of what we need to do is branding, is to convince people that what's made locally is good, and it's an issue of branding and marketing. But I think, you know, especially nowadays, if you can buy a lot of things locally and support local people, and money can go from the wealthier economy to the poorer economy, that's a good thing. You know, a dollar spent is in a sense a vote, and it supports. And if you can support your local communities and keep money in your local communities, I think that benefits everybody. So it's a great question. I think there is a certain local response to our purchasing. And if you can convince people in your country to do that, I think that would be great. And it would support. And if, yeah, well, I'll leave it at that, but I hope I answered it.
There are a lot of other great questions in this chat, and I hopefully will share your contact information, Peter, so people can get in touch with you.
I'll just share my screen again, and I have my email address there.
Or you put your email in the chat.
Yep, I can do that as well.
If you put in the chat, because I want to, if I could share a picture real quickly, because we just heard from a man who practices what he preaches. This is Sir Peter's classroom. You recognize that space, Peter? And there he is with his recycled containers. He's got his own garden growing, and he's got his own composting where students come into his classroom and they'll lift up those green lids. Got hundreds of worms, maybe thousands of worms in there, eating away at their leftover lunches. And he's just feeding his plants with this. Yeah.
Funny story about that. I got so many worms, I put them on Kijiji, red wrigglers. And it's unbelievable. People will pay for these worms.
Exactly.
And $35 for 300 worms.
All right. Well, I know a lot of you are anxious to get off to the social hour. They have a lot of fun there the last 2 days. Peter, we can't thank you enough for sharing your knowledge, your experience with us. Just brilliant talk today. Really inspired us and made us think critically about our practices and what we can do with regards to ending poverty. So thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. I enjoyed it, and I posted my email address. I'll keep an eye on my email, and I'd love to answer any questions that people have. I noticed there were more people that wanted to ask questions. I'd be happy to answer them.
That'd be great.
Right.
There's a link to the survey in here. We'd love for you all to take as well. Your valuable insight to help us create and enhance an even greater global summit this coming fall. So we'd really appreciate your input. And I also put a link to the fundraising campaign. So if you in any way can connect to your network of friends and family to help us build our program and create summits in the future where we're all together, not virtually, but where we can embrace one another physically, would be amazing. So we just want to keep this program going. So thank you for your support. And with that, is there anything else to add, Miriam, I'm forgetting?
No, I've posted a link for the feedback form. Everybody, thank you so much for coming. And I guess head to the social hour now.
Fantastic. Wow. This is it, folks. As I click this button, leave meeting for all, this ends our first annual Global Summit for MUN Impact. Can't thank you enough for being participants and presenters. It's been wonderful. So thank you all very much. Stay safe, stay healthy, and let's end this pandemic and get to work. Bye-bye all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Really great to see you.
Yeah, what time does the social hour start?
It starts now, and it really, do you have a link to it?
I don't. Could you send me one?
I will. I don't have it actually myself, so I will figure it out and I'll email it to you.
Yeah, sure. That'd be great.
And the last couple of days, they've been really having a lot of fun playing Pictionary, and just some of them said we just were talking the whole time. We weren't even playing games. Getting to know one another is wonderful.
That's
and
cool.
Then I think they've created the next project, which is going to be the MUN Impact Talent Show.
Oh, no way. That's awesome.
Yeah. To our interpreters, thank you all so much. I'm sorry I didn't give you a shout out at the end. You all are amazing. Cannot thank you enough. I loved clicking on my link. I don't know any Spanish, but hearing your voices is such a beautiful language. So thank you all.
Yeah, I see Joshua still has his hand up. Does he still want to ask a question? Is that possible?
I'll leave the room open for a sec, sure. Joshua? Yeah. Get your mic off there. Let's see, unmute you. There he goes. Yep.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. I wanted to ask the poor people, those who have special skills like farming skills, how do you expect those people to be recognized by the governmental and non-governmental organizations in order for them to earn money through their selling of crops?
Mm. Yeah, agriculture. Okay, so I grew up on a farm, and my parents had a dairy farm in the Netherlands, and we had a big chicken farm here in Canada. And farming, like any primary resource, requires an immense amount of support from the government. And I think if there's any area where a country might want to be very careful with they might want to protect, it's their primary resources. And so many countries can grow their own food. Uganda can easily grow food for the country and beyond. Same with Kenya. And I think in agriculture, often the issue is systems. And there are some very unfair trade practices around the world that really squash agriculture in many, for example, in African countries. And I think governments need to protect their farmers. And I think farming, I don't know what it's like in Ghana, but in Kenya and in Uganda, farming is seen as something that people kind of do on the side, but isn't necessarily seen as viable business. And but agriculture can be really good business. It should be good business. You're providing a basic need. That should be better business than, say, professional sports or anything. I mean, we all need to eat. And so that's an industry, an area that people should see as a viable business. But unfortunately, in a lot of countries, it's really hard to make ends meet, providing something that everybody needs. And that's bizarre. That's strange. And so I think sometimes there's a bit of an attitude at agriculture. It's something that poor people do who don't have choices. And if you get educated, you get out of that. But I think education should include agriculture. Agriculture is an industry that I think people should make good money doing. And that does happen in Canada. Farmers do well, and as they should, but they're also to some extent protected as a result. I don't know if I'm answering your question, and I don't know Ghana all that much, but.
All right, Peter, I think I have to close the room.
Oh, do you? Okay. Sorry, I don't hear Joshua there. But.
Yeah, if he has a response, it'd be fine.
So Joshua, do you unmute?
I just emailed you. I just emailed you the social hour link.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
You good, Josh? Yep, Joshua's good. All right, fabulous.
All right. Well, nice to meet you, Joshua. Okay.
All right. Okay, folks, I'm going to shut down, and Peter, I'll see you in the social hour.
Yeah. All right, thanks, Andrew.
Thank you, guys.